Good afternoon. I am Teresa Córdova, Director of the Great Cities Institute at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Before I turn it over to Stephen Small to begin today's program, we would like to acknowledge the original people and caretakers of the land now called Newark, New Jersey, the Lenni Lenape, who are part of the Algonquin Nation. We also honor, with our commitment to justice and care, the many indigenous people who call this home, past, present, and future. Stephen?
Thank you very much, Teresa. Good afternoon and welcome to everyone. My name is Stephen Small. I'm the director of the Institute for the Study of Societal Issues, also known as ISSI, and I'm a professor in the departments of African American Studies and African Diaspora Studies, both at the University of California. Along with the Great Cities Institute at the University of Illinois at Chicago, we are hosting this series on Black mayors and leadership in the United States. Welcome to the second of 3 panel discussions. We are joined by a number of co-sponsors on campus at Berkeley, across California, and also across the United States, and we are grateful for their support. The Institute for the Study of Societal Issues fosters innovative, community-engaged, interdisciplinary research on issues central to social stratification, inequality, and social justice. And we train, advise, and mentor the next generation of social change scholars to identify and collect empirical data to achieve social justice. The Institute was founded in 1976 by Professor Troy Duster, and its original name was the Institute for the Study of Social Change. Since it opened, more than 220 students have gone through ISSI, earned PhDs, and can be found today working or directing programs at universities, foundations, and community organizations across the United States. And more than 70% of ISSI doctoral graduates are Black, Latino, or from other underrepresented groups. Now, let me introduce today's panel. First of all, let me wholeheartedly thank Ras J. Baraka, the mayor of the city of Newark, New Jersey, for joining us for an hour of conversation on the wealth gap in the United States. We want to recognize our co-sponsors for this event: African American Mayors Association, National Urban League, California Association of Black Lawyers, Charles Houston Bar Association, Litigation Division of the California Bar Association, the Goldman School of Public Policy at UC Berkeley, the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley, the Equal Justice Society, the City Club of Chicago, Executive Clubs of Chicago, the Chicago Community Trust, Metropolitan Family Services of Chicago, Communities Partnering for Peace Institute for Nonviolence, Chicago, and Strides for Peace and WBGO Radio in Newark, New Jersey. Today's event is being live recorded, and all of our wonderful guests in attendance will be muted for the duration of this program. However, we invite our audience members to submit questions throughout the program using the Zoom Q&A feature. We want to welcome and thank all of our incredible speakers today: our moderator, Tracy Jan from the Washington Post, and panelist Dr. Elsie Harper-Anderson, Associate Professor and Director of the PhD program at the L. Douglas Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs at Virginia Commonwealth University. Dr. Paul Ong, an urban planner and economist and research professor at the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs, and also Director of the Center for Neighborhood Knowledge. And Dr. Darren Walker, the President of the Ford Foundation. Dr. Walker is also co-founder and chair of the President's Council on Disability Inclusion in Philanthropy. Now it is my pleasure to introduce the mayor. Ras J. Baraka is the 40th mayor of the city of Newark, New Jersey, a native of New Jersey whose family has lived in the city for more than 80 years. Mayor Baraka's progressive approach to governing has won him accolades from grassroots organizations and the White House. With a forward-thinking agenda that reduced crime to its lowest levels in 5 decades, an agenda that addressed affordability while maintaining steady growth, that lowered unemployment and retained local control of schools after more than 2 decades. Mayor Baraka has defied expectations since taking office in 2014. Mayor Baraka's futuristic agenda includes a groundbreaking partnership called Hire, Buy, Live Newark, a program that marks the first time that any US city has sought to transform its economy by combining employment, procurement, and residential strategies. And as part of Mayor Baraka's commitment to strengthen Newark's position in the expanded technology space, the city launched a communications network of sidewalk kiosks that provide free Wi-Fi, device charging, and more. And his executive order designating Newark as a sanctuary city solidified his status as one of the country's most progressive elected officials. Mayor Baraka was educated in Newark public schools. He received a Bachelor of Arts degree in political science and history from Howard University in Washington, D.C., and earned a master's degree in education supervision from St. Peter's University in Jersey City. Mayor Baraka is a doting husband and father of 3 daughters and a son. And Mayor Baraka is also a published author. Now, I'll turn the panel over to our distinguished guest, Mayor Baraka. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Small. I appreciate that, and thank you for the introduction. And obviously, I want to thank the University of California at Berkeley and the University of Illinois at Chicago as well for inviting me to be a part of this presentation to discuss the relationship between the wealth gap in this country and systemic racism. It almost seems like an obvious kind of relationship, seeing as though we were actually property itself upon our arrival here in this country. I probably represent the only people that came here against their will, as property, as was outlined in the Constitution as 3/5 of human being, as was codified in Dred Scott in 1857, that stated that we had no rights that other folks were bound to respect, that we were in fact property. And because we were property, we could not own. I think that is the foundation of this wealth gap. I think that is the root of the wealth gap. And the irony of it is the work, the slave labor that took place in this country was really a precursor for the serious American mechanization and industrial revolution here, the cotton and the development and use of textiles and cotton. Not only empowered industry in America, it the United States provided this material to most of the world at that time. So our ancestors' contribution to the development of this country is unparalleled, and it's very clear in history what that was. So I think that is the foundation. I had to mention that because when you start talking about the wealth gap, you see immediately that there's a clear head start. In fact, we were not even in the race, and so we began getting in that. I guess people would argue right after the Civil War, and there was really nothing done. The 40 acres and a mule really was not anything other than a rumor, a wartime opportunity that did not develop into anything. And so the ownership of land, of property, of advancing oneself was actually, we had the unenviable position of trying to do that on our own. And while people say, that other people had that is actually not the case. Historically, it is clear to see that those are the foundations of the huge gap that we have, right? If you want to get clearer, because I can talk about this part of it for a very long time. If you want to move further or closer to where we are, a great book to read is Crabgrass Frontier by Kenneth Jackson, that really talks about what happened after the New Deal and after World War II, and the creation of the suburbs and the redlining of communities where housing being the bedrock of wealth in America, where housing was made cheap, land was made cheap. The FHA created, began to give 20 to 30-year mortgages, really geared towards GIs, but expanded to American families that really created opportunities for people to leave inner cities and go to suburbs and subsidize transportation, highways in Newark, 280, 78, subsidized this and allowed homes to be built at interest rates that were very low, while at the same time redlining communities, making it difficult for other people, Black and brown folks, to get mortgages, to receive loans, to do those things in those communities. And while they created housing in the suburbs, they invested in what we call projects, subsidized buildings where people lived basically on top of each other in these communities, where services were provided by property taxes, and everybody that owned property or were moved out into suburbs. And so people began to live in the suburbs and work in the city, taking the wealth from the city into the suburbs. And that has been a longstanding a kind of thing that has not been interrupted to this day. The New Deal has catapulted generations of families into wealth, allowing them opportunity to receive what we know as the American dream, while locking, and while it may not have been its intent, it was certainly the result, locking millions of families out of that by circling them in poverty in these communities with poor resources, and not allowing investment to happen in those neighborhoods, in those communities, very deliberately and very purposely, and then assessing the values and the properties in those neighborhoods so low that it discouraged future investment as well. So those things happen, and as a result of that, in New Jersey, the median household wealth for a white family is about $352,000. The median household wealth is $352,000. I want you to hear this so you can really get to see the severity of it. For Latinx families in New Jersey, the median household wealth is $7,300. $7,300. In New Jersey, the median household wealth for Black families is a meager $6,100. $6,100. So that gap is so large, it would take centuries probably to kind of fill that gap. And if you go to U.S. median household wealth, just in the U.S. outside of New Jersey, the median wealth for white families is $171,000. $171,000. For Latinx families, about $20,700, and for Black families, $17,600. So while the numbers are not as stark, the gap is still large, but it shows that New Jersey, where I live, has one of the largest wealth gaps, if not the largest wealth gap in the nation, which means the work that we have to do in Newark and in places like Newark, Trenton, Camden, Patterson, is enormous. Work that mayors have to do in order to mitigate this wealth gap is almost miraculous, right? The things that we have to come up with against a system that's already designed to uphold and bolster this wealth gap that exists. The lack of home ownership, the assessment of property is still the same, the lack of and giving people loans or mortgages at interests that they can afford, the lack of investment in these communities and neighborhoods, the recurring of of poverty and taking away the tax base, making it difficult for people to pay for resources or services, something as simple as roads and schools and healthcare and homelessness or subsidizing of housing. All of that becomes difficult, and you create a cyclical kind of situation where this wealth gap perpetuates itself and creates a systemic level of poverty that exists, that at its foundation was white supremacy and racism that began with slavery and all of the policies that fed it all the way up until present day, because people always talk about slavery as being far removed. The Fair Housing Act is late 60s, early 70s. To prevent people from discriminating against you in housing is not that long ago, right? So, and housing to me is one of the fundamental things that we have to address when we start talking about the wealth gap in this country. Last thing, I want to add to that basically is that more than half, so 75% of the people that live in my city are renters, and more than half of the people pay at least 30% of their income on rent, on housing. At least 30% or more than income on housing. There are some families that pay almost 50% of their income on housing. So while the cost of living is increasing, people's wages are not increasing with that. Their dollar is not able to buy the same things that it bought. In fact, their dollar is less valuable now than it probably was 10 years ago, which makes it difficult for them to even sustain themselves, never mind accumulate wealth in this country. So I want to end there because I want to be able to get into some questions, but hopefully, I was able to help lay a foundation for some of the discussion and why this discussion is timely and important for us to have right now, particularly in COVID, which unearthed many of these things that people took for granted for very, very, very long. Our inability to quarantine, inability to isolate, the poor housing opportunities and conditions, the lack of access to healthcare, to quality food, all of those things became prominent in COVID and made it necessary for us to address this wealth gap. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Mayor, for sharing your insights and vision with us today, for your excellent linking of the harsh realities of wealth in the past and the obstacles to wealth acquisition for African Americans in the past, with the harsh realities of inequality and obstacles to wealth acquisition at the present time. We'll now turn the conversation with our excellent panelists over to our excellent panelists. Today's panel is moderated by Washington Post reporter Tracy Jan. Tracy Jan covers the intersection of race and the economy for the Washington Post, a beat she launched in December 2016 that encompasses racial economic disparities, immigration, housing policy, and other stories that hold business and politicians accountable for their decisions and promises. Her work has delved deeply into reparations for slavery, systematic racism in America, and the economic and health impact of the coronavirus pandemic on Black, Asian, Latino, and immigrant communities. Tracy Jam was previously a Washington-based national political reporter for the Boston Globe, where she covered the 2016 and 2012 presidential campaigns. During her 12 years at the Globe, Tracy Jan has also written about health and science policy, higher education, and Boston public schools. She started her career originally as a crime and courts reporter at the Oregonian and was a Knight Wallace Fellow at the University of Michigan. She was also a Fulbright Fellow in Taiwan. She has reported from Taipei, Beijing, Tibet, and along the Yangtze River. Tracy, thank you so much for your generosity of time, for your expertise, and for your knowledge. Over to you, Tracy, to take it from here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen. It's really a pleasure to be here with these esteemed panelists. Thank you, Mayor Baraka, for your setting us off perfectly. And again, I want to thank our hosts, the Institute for the Study of Societal Issues and the Department of African American Studies and African Diaspora Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, and the Great Cities Institute at the University of Illinois at Chicago for convening us for this important conversation, and to all of you for being here. Today's panelists are Darren Walker, Dr. Paul Ong, and Dr. Elsie Harper-Anderson. Stephen had given us a little bit of their bios, but I'll just go a little bit more in depth so you can know who these amazing people are. Darren Walker is the president of the Ford Foundation, a $13 billion international social justice philanthropy. He is also co-founder and chair of the President's Council on Disability Inclusion and Philanthropy. Before joining Ford, Darren was vice president at Rockefeller Foundation, overseeing global and domestic programs. In the 90s, he was COO of the Abyssinian Development Corporation, Harlem's largest community development organization. Darren co-chairs New York City's Mayoral Advisory Commission on City Art, Monuments, and Markers, the New York City Census Task Force, and the Governor's Commission, and serves on the Independent Commission on the New York City Criminal Justice and Incarceration Reform, and the UN International Labor Organization Global Commission on the Future of Work. Dr. Paul Ong is an urban planner and economist, research professor at the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs, and the director of the Center for Neighborhood Knowledge. I was fortunate enough to have tapped his expertise for a previous story I was writing about the impact of the coronavirus recession on gentrification of ethnic enclaves. His research focuses on socioeconomic and racial inequality and has conducted seminal work on spatial transportation mismatch and the urban spatial structure. He's engaged in several projects, including an analysis of the relationship between sustainability and equity, the racial wealth gap, and the role of urban structures on the reproduction of inequality. He currently leads the multidisciplinary COVID-19 Equity Research Initiative at UCLA, which examines the class and racial disparities on health, employment, housing, and education. Dr. Elsie Harper-Anderson is an associate professor and director of the PhD program at the L. Douglas Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs at Virginia Commonwealth University. Her research examines the impact of macroeconomic transformation on regional economies and urban labor markets, with a focus on social equity and sustainability. One of her current projects is examining the impact of COVID-19 and the CARES Act on African-American workers, businesses, and communities in Virginia. She is also currently studying inequality within entrepreneurial ecosystems. I will be asking our panelists questions for approximately 45 minutes. Our audience members are invited to submit questions throughout the program using the Zoom's Q&A feature. So let's get started. Mayor Baraka, I could have listened to you for hours because what you were talking about is exactly what I write about. And I just want to begin by asking you, you've already mentioned that New Jersey has one of the worst racial wealth gaps in the nation. And you also spoke about the correlation between this wealth gap, which exists across the nation, not just in New Jersey, and systemic racism. Not only did very few Black families receive land after the Civil War as promised as restitution for their enslavement, but 1.6 million white families were allotted 160 acres under the Homestead Acts enacted during and after the Civil War. Then this wealth disparity was further exacerbated by the massacres that occurred across the nation during Jim Crow, resulting in not only the loss of Black lives, but the destruction and appropriation of Black property. These inequities persist today with housing discrimination, even though it's illegal, education, health, criminal justice disparities, that all continue today to cement the wealth gap. So could you talk to us a little bit more in depth about what local, state, and federal government can do to help close this wealth gap? And we can begin obviously by what you're doing in Newark.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you for that and for laying that out. I think, at least on a local level where it's all been placed, in our hands around this thing that we're the most innovative. And while I take that, I also think it's a shirking of responsibility from the federal and the state government who actually needs to do the real work because they have most of the resources. But ultimately, locally, we try to create programs that reduce the cost of housing, subsidize the housing, but also create home ownership opportunities. We created a land bank here in the city of Newark to create opportunities for local folks to begin to buy homes and purchase land at very low prices to help create that opportunity. We created a fund that begins to fund small Black and brown businesses in our community. We're trying to get the state government on board with that. We're obviously a part of the mayor's guaranteed income nationally that we believe universal basic income beginning to give families, and we're going to start in April, giving families, families that are having a difficult time, subsidize their income with income here with cash payments over a 2-year period as a pilot to suggest, even if the state expands earned income tax credit, gives opportunities for families to get more cash in their homes and get rid of all of the kind of prerequisites that exist that prevent them from getting that. But I think that there needs to be a concerted effort on the federal and the state government to invest in these communities, to invest in families. I think there needs to be a discussion around a Marshall Plan, a local Marshall Plan here, like what happened in Europe after World War II, that something needs to happen in these communities. Whether you call it reparations or anything else, I think that those things should happen in our communities immediately, around housing, around income, around healthcare, around wealth. All of those things should be dealt with. But at the base of it, to me, is housing and being able to get people to stabilize their income in their households and give them access to quality and decent education that's affordable and free at the same time.
Thank you very much. I'd like to turn to Darren Walker to discuss the role and responsibilities of corporations as well as philanthropic foundations in addressing the wealth gap. Mr. Walker, you were on the advisory council for the Goldman Sachs initiative that was announced this morning to invest $100 billion in Black women. And you've written and spoken personally in the past about systemic racial inequality, that this wealth gap did not just occur by happenstance, nor is it some unavoidable destiny. Instead, you've written, it was created by the hands and sustained effort of people who engineered benefits for themselves to the detriment of everyone else. To the detriment of everyone else. Those are pretty powerful words. Following George Floyd's killing, we've seen corporations spanning every sector come out with promises to address systemic racism, both internally and in their communities at large. What do you think is the single most important move corporations should be making to help close the wealth gap?
I think the move that will be the game changer is to change the leadership and boards of corporate America, because that is where the power lies, where decisions are made, and where representation matters. If you look at the companies that are more diverse in their boards, you will see companies that are serving communities of color and African Americans communities better. And so I argue that we need a plan to hold the many CEOs who engaged in some powerful performative acts, making broad statements about Black Lives Matter, et cetera. We need to hold them to account. So a year after the murders, let's see how much progress we have made. 1/3 of the S&P 500 had no African American. Most of the NASDAQ listed companies had no African American. So when we see those numbers start to change, Tracy, I believe we then can have the promise of sustained engagement. The challenge here is that companies make commitments that are time bound. They make a commitment for a year or two, the media goes away, and they go back to business as usual. When you have African Americans on the board, when you have in the C-suite folks of color, it is not as easy for companies. I know I sit on 3 public company boards, and I can assure you my presence on those boards adds a dimension to the board agenda and to the tenor of the conversation around the board table. And so when we see more of us at the board table, we will see more changes in the policies and practices of corporate America.
That's wonderful. I was going to address this board diversity issue. And just to assure you, I will not go away. The Washington Post will not go away on these issues. Corporations have long lamented the fact that their boards aren't diverse, that there just aren't enough people out there to tap, which we know is untrue. What's different this time? What will make this promise more sustainable to ensure that this actually happens? Is it the NASDAQ pushing for greater diversity, or is it something else?
Well, Tracy, I think the reality is, and this is what is so incredibly frustrating, the data are clear that companies with more diverse boards, with more diverse leadership teams outperform. And so what is amazing to me is for an industry that is a sector of our society that is so driven by data, facts and information, why won't these facts, data, and information be received and be acted upon? I think they won't be and haven't been because it requires incumbents. It requires the privileged who sit in these boardrooms to change their behaviors, to change their practices. And privileged people do not like change. They certainly do not like change that will in any way diminish their own privilege. And I think for a lot of board members, for a lot of CEOs, this kind of accountability, this kind of demand for fairness feels like oppression. Because to privileged people, fairness sometimes feels like oppression. Because fairness is requiring them to be accountable for their rhetoric. It is requiring them. And so what's changing this time around, I'll give you one example that did not exist 10 years ago, the power of employee resource groups in big companies. 5 years ago, 10 years ago, when I worked on Wall Street at a big bank, the number of Blacks we could have met in a phone booth. Today, when you go to a Fortune 500 company, you will see large numbers of ERGs, employee resource groups. And those groups have power now. They are being heard. And I can tell you, I've met with the employee resource groups at some companies, and the CEO, they are listening to those folks because those folks were the ones who helped them navigate their way through uncharted waters that they did not know. Most of the white CEOs had no idea how to navigate what we were experiencing last year in the wake of those murders. They found out that they actually had assets within their own companies who could help them. And so that is one big intervention that has changed. Now, for your question about philanthropy, let me just say, philanthropy is also a sector of privilege. And while we like to think in philanthropy that we are progressive, that we are anti-racist, I would not submit that we are either of those things when you really get down to it. We have work to do. If you look at our boards across the sort of large foundations and family foundations, you don't see sufficient diversity. You don't see people responding to what Dr. King said in 1968 about philanthropy. He said the following: philanthropy is commendable, but it should not allow the philanthropist to overlook the economic injustice which makes philanthropy necessary. So what he was saying to this group of philanthropists in 1968, weeks before he was murdered, was don't be so comfortable. Don't be so smug in your success that you actually aren't understanding your own culpability and some of the very problems you're seeking to solve. So that work has yet to be done in philanthropy.
That's right. You mentioned after the social justice protests all across the country this summer that your white CEO friends were reaching out to you as their Black friend to advise them. But now you're saying they should be turning to their employee resource groups if they have them, right? They should also not let donating to philanthropy be the one and final step that they do.
But Tracy, it's hard to go before your Black ERG when you don't have anybody Black on your board or Black in the C-suite. And as I said to one person who asked me to come to their meeting with them, I said, I can't go with you to be introduced as your Black friend. Like that makes you look bad and me look stupid. So, but the fact that you don't have anybody and you got to go find a Black friend practically off the street and bring him onto a Zoom call with you and your Black employees is a statement, is an indictment of your leadership.
That's right. That's powerful. You've also criticized our existing economic system for putting the interest of capital over labor, compounding privilege at the expense of opportunity. What can corporations do to reform capitalism in order to seriously address growing inequality? And is it realistic to expect people with power and privilege, as you said a few minutes ago, to be willing to give some of it up?
I think we're going to have policy that actually puts workers at the center, policy that does not privilege some of the actions, some of the capital structures within corporate America. And I think we're going to have a different kind of capitalism if capitalism is going to sustain. Look, I'm a believer in capitalism. Actually, we've never had capitalism in America, if we're to be true. I mean, I know there are a lot of people where America is the land of capitalism, and capitalism is not an economy where you don't pay for labor. Capitalism is not an economy where you draw red lines around Black neighborhoods and say private capital won't go into those neighborhoods. That's not capitalism. That actually is a perversion of capitalism. I actually would like capitalism to work. And so in order for that to happen, we've got to have policy, and we've got to have some of the things, as the good mayor Baraka is saying, at the local level. They are experimenting. Those experiments that are working need to be scaled and need to be resourced.
Great. So the coronavirus pandemic has given us an opportunity. Well, first, it's shown a spotlight in all the fissures and gaping racial inequality in our country, not only in healthcare, but in housing and economic inequality. But the optimists amongst us have said this could be an opportunity for our country to start addressing this seriously. Mayor Baraka, can you tell us a little bit more in detail about the guaranteed income task force that began pre-pandemic, and how has the past year impacted those conversations? You mentioned it was going to start in April, but how much money, how many people,
Right.
What's the scope?
So in Newark, our scope is about 400 people. It's a pilot all over the country. Mayors have signed on and doing the same. I think we have 2 in New Jersey now, 1 here and 1 in Patterson. In April, we're going to start with about 30, 35 people. And we're scaling it up, and we have an IRB. We are studying this information because the ultimate goal of it is not to just do 400 people. The ultimate goal of it is to do what was mentioned: get the resources from state and federal government and change policy where these things happen. And as you can see during the pandemic, that it wasn't difficult to find a check to give to people around this country, millions of people, that they were able to make this happen with all the discussion about where it's going to come from, how it's going to get funded. In this crisis, these things happen. And I think, the COVID crisis escalated and expedited the conversation. Like it put it front and center when you saw all of these people out of work, people can't pay their rent, people not able to pay their taxes, their mortgage, a family that has a problem that's about $400 almost cripples them. Like all of these things became really, really relevant. And so locally, we had to try to figure that out. And the state governments engaged with us in that, which I think began to create a larger national discussion about what should happen, whether you're talking about stimulus checks or opportunities to help people around their rent, housing and homelessness, all of those issues that have been here, by the way, for decades. But sometimes it has to get really, really dark for you to see the stars, right? So it's important to understand that many people are moving together around these issues because they really don't have any other options.
Right, that's right. I want to bring in our academics here. Professor Harper-Anderson, do you mind weighing in on the impact of the pandemic on the wealth gap, particularly for Black Americans? And you could feel free to jump in on any of the conversation that we've already been having with the mayor and with Darren.
I think that the impact of the pandemic, the current pandemic on the wealth gap, is going to be much greater than the impact on the Great Recession for a number of reasons. One, the unemployment was so much higher with this pandemic. For example, in Virginia, while whites, the number unemployed increased by 46% between February and August. For Blacks, it increased by 218%. So the wealth gap here in Virginia has not only remained through the pandemic, but has gotten much wider. So the pandemic will impact that. Also, the health implications of the current pandemic are going to have tremendous economic implications, not only because there have been so many deaths, heads of household dying, also the cost of healthcare when this is all said and done, the number of people who have had to seek healthcare. In addition, our work, how we understand work has changed. The requirement to telework. We see from the data that CPS is collecting that, of course, African Americans are not in positions that they are able to telework from. And so that has a financial impact. And also CPS asked the question, current population survey asked the question, whether you missed work last week because of COVID. Larger numbers of African Americans are missing work because of COVID, and they are concentrated in those sectors that are most impacted by COVID. So I think that this pandemic is going to have a tremendous impact on not only immediate inequality in wealth, but longer term, because I think the way we work after the pandemic might change, and that's to the disadvantage of African Americans. So I think that, of course, we've seen devastating effects so far, but I think in longer term, we're going to see much more effects that will overlay on the structural inequality that already exists. And I think the only thing that can change that, as our former speakers, Darren Walker and Ras Baraka, have said, is policy. We need policy that is going to address not the surface, but the structure of the inequality. Why do we have so many? Why are African Americans and Latinos mostly concentrated in sectors where there is not the ability to telework and deal with the digital divide and deal with some of those other issues?
Right. I spoke to so many people over this last year, the last campaign, who were touting President Trump being the best for Black Americans ever because of the historically low unemployment rates. But then when you look at the numbers, what does that mean? Just because you have a job that's minimum wage or below minimum wage, if you work in the service industry, you can't pay for healthcare, you don't have health benefits, you can hardly pay rent. Yeah. I mean, when you look at the inequality that was already there before compared to now, it's we have a long ways to go. Professor Ong, can you talk about that compared to the Great Recession and also what your research has shown about who is actually getting the government help that's already been out there, especially for entrepreneurs?
Yeah, I fully agree with the panelists. I think we're facing a major crisis in terms of a growing wealth and income gap. The evidence that we have so far clearly shows that African Americans have been disproportionately hurt financially and economically. So for example, Blacks are 1/4 to 1/3 more likely to have suffered earnings loss than non-Hispanic whites. Moreover, the impact of a job loss is greater for Blacks. And that's because they don't have the financial resources prior to the pandemic. So consequently, we see, for example, African Americans are twice as likely to currently face financial difficulties in terms of covering daily expenses. Nearly 1/4 of Blacks are behind in terms of rent and mortgage. And many of them have to rely on savings and credit cards to just cover expenses. African-American homeowners are 2.5 times more likely to be behind on their mortgage today. And the bottom line is that the pandemic is systematically and unfairly stripping away assets and wealth along racial lines, and it's generating tremendous debts that people of color will come due at the end of this year. And so I fully agree, we need innovative, progressive policy. And I think we have lots of work to get there, because the current relief and assistance policies and programs by government and the private sector clearly is offsetting the pandemic impacts. Will be far worse without them. There's no question about that. Nonetheless, the efforts have failed on 3 fronts. One is that the support covers only a part of the financial losses. And we could see that here, like in Los Angeles, where we have efforts to help renters, but we have so little money that we have to have a lottery to see who gets those subsidies. There's also, this strategy is just kicking the can down the road. I mean, we are preventing evictions for those who can't pay the rent. We are trying to help people in terms of homeowners, in terms of holding back foreclosures, but the debts are accumulating. So we're just kicking the can down the road. And finally, the resources are not really reaching those most in need. And so you could see that, for example, in programs such as a Paycheck Protection Program, where we analyze that the money is really not going to the communities and the businesses most in need. We see that in terms of differences in forbearance, in terms of mortgage during this time period. So what we see is that there are tremendous inequalities currently in the policies and programs we have in terms of pandemic assistance. And it is actually in some ways making the problems worse. So I think we have a huge challenge in terms of coming up with those strategies that will really make a difference.
Right, and your research has shown that entrepreneurs in minority neighborhoods are less likely to receive PPP loans than businesses in white neighborhoods. I want to turn back to Mayor Baraka, because we know that minority-owned businesses are disproportionately impacted by the COVID recession. Can you talk to us a little bit more about Newark's 40 acres and the Mule Fund and how that's helping Black and Latino business owners, especially it being expanded beyond Newark into a statewide initiative?
Absolutely. Thank you. This is something we just really got off of the ground. We have commitments of about $30 million right now. It is now Newark, Irvington, East Orange, Patterson, Trenton. So it's a few cities that have signed up. And what we're trying to do is be able to give very low interest loans or grants to not just small businesses, but folks that are interested in real estate in this community, in these communities that are already here, that were affected by the pandemic, and invite other businesses to come into these municipalities at the same time, to just create an atmosphere where people begin to understand that businesses will be supported, buttressed and protected in these communities. And we want to create that atmosphere. So right now people are signing up and trying to get access to this funding. And I think it's important because a lot of these businesses that we're talking about don't really have the balance sheet or the relationship with these larger financial institutions to get the loans that they need, or the money, the capital that they need in order to do the work that they need in their business, or expand it or help it sustain itself, or in real estate as well. And that's what really our intentions are. Prayerfully by the end of this quarter, we'll have surpassed our fundraising goal and begin to give some of this money out.
That's great. We're starting to get some audience questions here, and I just want to ask one very good one before we lose the mayor and we lose Mr. Walker at 4 o'clock. What are you doing to reverse the disadvantages you're talking about in your personal, political, or professional life? What can ordinary white Americans do to help? Mayor, I'll start with you, and then I'll move on to Mr. Walker.
Well, everything that we do has to address that. I mean, and that's what folks have to understand. Like, when you're in charge of these cities, you just don't have to worry about the snow removal and the garbage and road paving. You actually have to fight poverty and crime and housing issues and homelessness and all these issues that exist that are endemic to this society that were created by this inequity that we continuously talk about. So the better you do at that, the more you're sustaining people's lives. So every day that we make an opportunity to reduce people's rent, that we put more money in their pockets through guaranteed income or through raising the minimum wage, or opportunities that we have to give people access to low-income property and housing to purchase. All of those things are ways to destroy historic racism and systemic inequality in this country. And we do it particularly for Black and brown people in these neighborhoods that are suffering the most. I think that whether you're a white person or privileged in any aspect of the word, or any other person, you should be advocating for the kind of policy that we need on local, state, and national levels. And you should be actively doing that, and not just say, I have Black friends, or I'm not racist, or, the things, I don't see color, that people say to me, I don't see color, which is what a lot of people in these institutions say. And I tell them that's the beginning of the problem, because I want you to see me. See my inequity, my problems, the culture that I have. If you see me first, then maybe you'll decide to do something about it.
That's wonderful. Mr. Walker?
Thank you, Tracy. I think that certainly in my world of philanthropy, the work that we have to do is to build allyship and to change the mindset, if you will, because the mindset has to move from seeing communities as vulnerable communities, but rather targeted communities. These communities, folks aren't innately vulnerable. Their communities are vulnerable because they've been targeted by predatory lenders. They've been targeted by environmental waste that is disproportionately located in Black and brown communities, et cetera. We have to, in philanthropy, get at the root cause of these challenges and move from generosity and charity to dignity and justice. And what that is going to require is for us to put a new headset on, a headset that acknowledges that we can either be a part of the problem by investing in private prisons, which we have found that actually some foundations have done, or we can help to change the criminal justice system. And so I think these choices are critical. I believe I need to be building allyship. We need white allies. This country, the things that we are talking about is not going to happen. It will not happen without cross-racial, cross-class, cross-geography alliances. And so we have to build those alliances, and we have to have our allies be with us on that journey and understand that it is a journey, and that for many whites on this journey, it's a new experience. It's a new experience to listen. It's a new experience to not center yourself, but to center the people who are closest and most proximate to the challenge. And in the experience that is new, our allies, our white allies, will make mistakes. They will say the wrong word. They will, in phraseology, misstate something. We need to not be so reflexive as to immediately taint them with the label of racist or whatever, and understand that people are going to make mistakes, and we need to be on the journey together. And if you're willing to be on the journey with us, I think we all have got to do this together.
Very wise words. Professor Harper-Anderson, do you have anything to say about what white people can do to be better allies?
I think the most important thing that's been said so far is listen and understand structural racism, but also to try to be innovative in approaches when you are in charge of an organization, a city, or whatever, to be innovative in how you include African Americans, both at the top and as part of the decision-making process. So we often talk about the importance of having African Americans on boards and in positions of power, and that is of critical importance. I agree with what Darren Walker said earlier. As director of the PhD program at the Wilder School, I know that my place in the room during admissions matters. So white people can play a role. It isn't just beholden on Black people who are at the top to pull other Black people up. They can play a role in pulling other Black people up too, holding their peers accountable for diversity and inclusion, and as opposed to just adding more Black people, you have a responsibility as well.
Great. I want to ask the mayor a final question before his departure. This is from an audience member. He says, we're currently on the verge of getting stimulus funding signed into law by the end of the week. Mayor Baraka, can you speak to other city leaders about how the funding that is going into cities and towns of all sizes can positively impact inequalities that our communities face?
Sure, there are, and a matter of fact, we're having a discussion this evening at 5:30 with mayors throughout New Jersey to discuss the new stimulus money that we were praying for this time. And there's money that's going to be available around housing, around small businesses, around opportunities to deal with folks that are behind on their rent, mortgage issues. So it's opportunities there. Obviously, you have to apply for some of these things around healthcare that you can use this money. We've used some of our CARES dollars to deal with the difficult to house population residents without addresses or homelessness. We just did a community, a pilot of container homes that we put together for the homeless residents in the city of Newark. So using CARES dollars. So this larger pot of money, we'll be discussing what we're going to get and how we can use that to do exactly what was asked, how to mitigate some of the issues that were brought about because of COVID, but existed pre-COVID.
Great. Any final words before you depart? And I'm going to ask Mr. Walker the same thing before he has to head out.
No, I just think this is an important discussion, and I think that we need to elevate it as much as we can nationally and continue to talk about it until it becomes mainstream discussion of how we deal with this wealth gap in a very concrete and material way and develop policies to do the same.
Wonderful. Mr. Walker?
I couldn't agree with the mayor more. He said it very eloquently. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you both for joining us today. I look forward to calling you both in the future as I do my stories.
Please do. Please do.
Got it.
We'll be continuing this discussion, and thank you again to Mayor and Mr. Walker for joining us. They have to leave now. Thank you for your time and sharing your vision. We'd like to continue the Q&A, so anyone who has a question is welcome to ask that in the little Zoom box. Let me see. Oh, our leaders have left. Let me just continue on with our academics for a little bit longer. How does the COVID recession compare to the Great Recession just over a decade ago? Dr. Harper-Anderson, you've spoken about this a little bit on the similarities and differences, but in terms of the recovery, what is that going to look like for Black Americans and other communities of color?
I think the recovery is going to be, it's hard to say what it's going to look like, first of all, primarily because a number of the unemployment numbers are misleading. The number of African Americans who have had to continue to work in frontline industries during the pandemic and to provide the services necessary for that has kept the unemployment numbers from being as low as they would have been. But I think as the fallout from business losses and businesses that have had to close becomes a reality in the coming months, I think that the recovery will be difficult. If you look at studies 10 years after the Great Recession, African Americans are still not back to their wage from pre-recession. So I have to believe that it's going to be an even greater impact this time, which is going to go on top of the loss that we took in the last recession. So continuous layering of disadvantage and inequality.
Right. We've spoken about the role of corporations, of philanthropy, of government in addressing this pandemic, recession, and addressing inequality. Professor Ong, what is the role of higher education in addressing the wealth gap, especially at this moment?
I would believe, and this is a biased opinion, that we can make a contribution. And what we do best is generate knowledge. And I do believe in evidence-based intervention, evidence-based policy. But that means you have to have that detailed knowledge, not just the larger, important normative vision for social justice, but what are the mechanisms? I think we can make that contribution, but I also believe that higher education has failed to do that. Let me just go back to the comment by Professor Harper-Anderson. We actually don't know what's going to happen in the recovery. It's like looking into a crystal ball. The good thing is some people have better crystal balls than others. They're clearer. But, people who do this work, like, for example, on our campus, the Anderson forecast, they're nationally renowned. But by and large, they have failed in their work to really understand inequality, racial inequality. It's not an integral part of their work, their models, their projection models. And because we fail to do that, we meaning the university and the researchers, we're not making the maximum contribution. And I hope that the crisis that we faced over the last year and the demand from Black Lives Matter will transform the university so we will pay more attention. And we need to not just have ethnic studies involved. I am a faculty in ethnic studies, but we also need other units involved, the business school, some of the other ones that will give you the detailed knowledge that hopefully could guide us to a more just recovery.
Yeah, that's great. Newsrooms are going through the same thing in terms of people's attention on covering this.
Could I add something to what higher ed can give?
Of course.
I think that there are several roles for higher education. I think the knowledge, of course, is the main thing that we do. But I think that in terms of the wealth gap, we all know that people with higher levels of education end up earning more, and earnings are critical to building wealth. But I think the cost of education has just gotten outrageous. And so one of the things that institutes of higher education can do is look at the costs. So if you look at the historical inequality and you look at most white families, we just talked about how much wealth they have. And if your parents can afford to put you through college, as opposed to you taking on more debt, whereas an African-American student whose parents can't pay their tuition and they're taking out loans, that's creating more further down the line inability to accumulate wealth because you're paying your student loan for forever. It goes back to the systematic inequality that has existed. Also, we're giving inadequate aid. We give financial aid, but there's a lot that goes to that. As a first generation African college student who is still paying her student loans and the mother of a college student, if I am paying my student loans and then I have to take out loans for my child, I mean, it's either she takes out the loans and she's in debt as I am, or I take out the loans and I never get out of debt. So the aid package for someone who is not in poverty, but maybe you have 2 kids in college and you're one generation out of poverty yourself, that creates, a situation. So we need to think about that. Also, I think that in terms of African Americans even getting into college, we know that just the biases in all of the testing that we use to determine admissions and even to let first generation students enter college. So I think there are several things that institutes of higher education can do in order to help to deal with or lessen the wealth gap. I see that schools are now starting to get rid of the SATs and GREs, which opens the door for a lot more underprivileged students, first generation students to be able to enter college. But we still need to take a look at the cost of education, and we need to think more innovatively about how we give aid and how we think about who deserves aid and who doesn't, and not just get disadvantaged students to the door, but get them in and get them through.
Right, that's right. And now during the pandemic, we're going to see a lost generation of a lot of first generation college students who would have been first generation college students because of their inability to not work. They don't have the luxury to not work and help their families through this. There's a really good question from an audience member about cities with better diversity and equity showing higher per capita income for all races. I was wondering if either of you is able to speak to whether there's any evidence of benefit to white communities from achieving equity that can be shared with them.
One of the things is that we see a correlation, association between the two. That is, cities and regions that do well tend to have lower racial stratification. We see that in the labor market, we see that in housing, we see that in terms of segregation. And so the big question always is, we see correlation, but what's the causality? Is it because cities are able to do well that they could afford to be more generous in terms of getting through the whole system with race? Or do we have racial equality somehow in diversity, and that strengthens the regional economy, and therefore everybody contributes? The answer is probably it's a little bit of both, which means that it's challenging because you have to think not only about racial justice, but how do you think about growth, economic growth, and then also how do you strengthen those mechanisms that allows that growth to be distributed much more fairly. And vice versa, if we promote diversity in a city, how do we take advantage of that diversity in terms of strengthening our local economy? How do we take advantage of everybody's potential contribution? So it's challenging, but I do think there is that association. Clearly the evidence is there. The challenge is really understand the mechanism, and from understanding the mechanism, what policies should we have?
Yeah, right. That's good. Here's another similar question from another audience member. He's a white man who grew up in low-income housing, served in the military, became a social worker, and is now an attorney. He's hearing a lot about policy today, which he believes is critical to sustain progress. But he's always been concerned by the exploitation of racial divisions in politics, as we've just seen very clearly in the last two elections, and obviously in elections before that too. How do we improve messaging around the income gap issue, which is bad for all races, and build on and sustain voter coalitions? Is that in either of your wheelhouses?
It's not in my wheelhouse.
I have an opinion. I'm not sure.
Share your opinion. Come on.
I think there's no question the last 4 years, we've seen the politics of racial division. And clearly it is along black and white lines, but it's not just along that line. We've seen, for example, the rise of anti-Asian hate. And so race is one that unfortunately is deeply embedded in our society. And because it's deeply embedded, it becomes a potential weapon for those who are politically ambitious. So you could do one or two things, it seems to me. One is you directly counter that narrative. That is, how do you message out about fake news? How do you sort of get to the public insights that there are certain great benefits to diversity, to inclusiveness, and so forth. But I think there's a deeper problem, which goes back to Mr. Walker's comment about capitalism. In our society, in our market, I think it is unfortunately that many individuals, white, black, brown, Asians, are exploited by a system. They feel exploited. And essentially what the politics of racialization is to take that feeling of economic and financial alienation and turn it towards race. So again, we could try to turn the view away from race, but I think ultimately we have to deal with the deeper economic inequalities that is constantly being generated. Again, going back to Mr. Walker and Mayor Baraka, that there are deep problems in our society that we have to pay attention to. That is linked to race, but also in some ways need to be treated separately from race. How do we have just wages? How do we deal with the unacceptable minimal federal hourly wage that we have? I think we need to address these sort of deeper divides that's part of racism. Because I think if all you do is in a narrative sense, try to counter fake news, then you're not reaching down to the foundation of why people feel so alienated.
Right, thank you for that. I want to point our audience members to the research done by Professor Ian Haney-Lopez at UC Berkeley. He's a law professor there, and his research focuses on a link between racial divisions and growing wealth inequality. And he's made the argument that the Republicans have stoked racial resentment and fear to maintain power for the rich. Democrats have done that too in the past, not as recently, but they have. Thank you so much for all of your excellent questions. I'm going down the list to see if there's so many great questions. Okay, oh wow. We have the former mayor of Minneapolis here with us today, Betsy Hodges. She asks, what are some of the best arguments to make about why it is good for everyone, including white people, to invest in policies designed to build wealth, entrepreneurship, housing, and other wealth gap closers? It's similar to what we were just talking about before, but it brings us a little bit more forward. Anyone else? Dr.
Could you read it again?
Anderson?
Could you read the question again?
Yes, this is from the former mayor of Minneapolis, Betsy Hodges. What are some of the best arguments to make about why it's good for everyone, including white people, to invest in policies designed to build wealth, entrepreneurship, housing, and other wealth gap closers?
I would say because they make our economy stronger, which is beneficial to everyone. One of my areas of research is workforce development. And I did a study a number of years ago, which looked at the return on investment for public workforce programs. And I didn't expect this to be, controversial, but it ended up getting a lot of pushback. But I found that there is a much higher return on investment for having individuals with low levels of education and less work experience participate in workforce programs and receive training and receive certification, which is more expensive because of all the savings from public programs that they will then no longer need, like cash programs, healthcare programs, those sorts of things. And I was actually using administrative data from the state of Virginia. So my point is that the more that we lift up the bottom and that they're able to pay taxes and they're able to contribute to the economy, and then they are no longer dependent on public programs for support, the stronger our economy becomes, the more we save at the state and local levels. So I think that just building our economy is a reason to provide those supports and have people be contributors as opposed to just takers.
I think one of the best way is, Tracy, what you're doing. That is, we could do research, right? And we love to do research. That's our passion. But we're not good storytellers. We're not good communicators. To change public opinion really is about entering into that arena of telling valid stories. And valid stories, for me, should be based on evidence and fact. I mean, that's what I would hold people accountable for, not fake news. But again, it is this sort of storytelling and narratives. And it counters, I think, lots of conservative opinions about things. And I'll give you two quick examples. When we had welfare reform from AFDC, what's called AFDC TANF, work requirement, I was not necessarily supportive of it, but we realized, for example, you can't make that transition without having a good vehicle to get you to work, to take your children to school, to go to medical appointments. And we did as much research as we can, but what was really powerful is when people told stories about what it means not having a car and having a car. And that actually led the Clinton administration in the second round to redo the asset requirements so people can have a good car. A second example is that, there's a huge fear under the rubric of socialism in terms of guaranteed income. We can't do that because it makes people lazy. It makes people not go out for work. The evidence from Stockton, which had this experiment, shows just the opposite. That is, you have stability from this income. It's not a huge amount of income, but some stability. And it actually leads to great benefits in terms of higher employment, more contribution to the economy. Now, we could say that, my colleagues who do the research could say that, we have the numbers, but it's but the stories of the people, why that happens. And again, it's, Tracy, the burden's actually on you and your colleagues. Those stories, the human aspects of fact-based, but the human stories are what reach people. That's what changes people's opinion and suddenly see the light.
Thank you for validating my existence and paycheck. I do want to say my colleague Robert Samuels wrote a wonderful story about the impact of guaranteed income on women in Mississippi, I think a couple years ago. So you guys could Google that. Robert Samuels, Washington Post, Guaranteed Income, Mississippi. Here's another good question from another audience member. How might the rapid advancement of remote work during the pandemic rebalance regional economies? Can this create a broader base of opportunity in regions that have lagged in job creation and economic development? And what policies are required to ensure that remote organizations create a stake in the places where their employees reside? That's a very good question.
I want to answer this question from a racial equity lens, because I bring us back to the reality that that there's an imbalance in terms of whether African Americans having jobs that they can telework. And so, if we move to a model where there's more telework, they will be disadvantaged in not being able to do those jobs, because the simple view of it would be, okay, switch to that type of job. But normally those jobs are desk jobs, which require computer skills and those sorts of things. So if we go in that direction, I think there will be even more inequality in the labor force along racial lines because of it. As far as how it will impact the regional economy, that's an interesting question that I've been thinking about for a while, and I don't really have an answer to it, because I would need to, maybe Paul has data on whether companies that allow their workers to telework are located in the same region or not. I don't have data on that. Do you know more about that, Paul?
A little bit. I'm working with a colleague at UConn on this research about the impact, particularly the racial disparities in remote learning. But I do want to expand a little bit, if it's okay, on your comments, which I fully agree with. When we talk about systemic racism, we're talking about a very complex system. Mm-hmm. So it affects every arena. And so let's just take, if there's a massive shift and growth in remote learning, what does that mean, for example, in the way cities and suburbs are structured? And we're already starting to see evidence of what that means. It means not just remote work. It means white flight. And this is not new. It may be a new reoccurrence into the suburbs. Here in California, there's a big news about people leaving Silicon Valley, to Texas and so forth. But the data actually shows they're moving into the suburbs. They're moving into Sacramento. They're moving into other counties around the Bay Area. The big news about New York, emptying out. Yes, temporarily, but there was another article, again, by one of your colleagues, Tracy, about people who went to Florida and they're now thinking about going back to Manhattan. But nonetheless, I think there will be a basic transformation about how people live where they live. And that's going to restructure cities and the suburbs and what we call the exurbs. It's going to mean different things for Austin, Texas, than Los Angeles, California. And we're only beginning to understand what that means. But it does have potentially profound implication along racial lines. If you go back to the wonderful work that John Kane did on what he calls spatial mismatch in Detroit, What he talked about was with the freeways and highways, the opening of the suburbs, the movement of jobs away from the city into the suburbs, and where African Americans were trapped because of discrimination in the core area, it created a new disadvantage.
Mhm.
That is spatial mismatch. They are now farther away from employment opportunities. And that actually shows up empirically in terms of higher unemployment, lower wages. And so we need to think through concretely what's going to be the restructuring of cities, suburbs, regions, and so forth. Not only to identify the shortfalls, but what are the opportunities? Every crisis, there are two sides to it. Maybe I'm being a little sort of cliche, but there are two sides to this, and we need to certainly understand the damages that are potential and try to avoid them.
True.
There's also
I have to add to that. I would agree that at every point, there are opportunities and there are challenges. But if you look back over time, every time there's a transition where there are opportunities and challenges, the group that has historically been disadvantaged is not prepared to take advantage of the opportunities. So for example, when we moved to a knowledge-based economy and it was very focused on tech, those who did not have the technological skills could not take advantage of that. And I wrote an article a number of years ago about ARRA and the Recovery Act there, and the fact that so much money was focused on the green economy. All of a sudden, we were going to green everything. And however, African Americans were not in the sectors that could benefit from a focused approach on the green economy. And so I think that the same disadvantages that put us at a vulnerable place in the labor market and as entrepreneurs are the same disadvantages that put us in a disadvantage, that put us in a position that we're not able to take advantage of those opportunities. It's the same thing here. If we move to a telework environment, the data is already showing that African Americans are disadvantaged there for a number of reasons, whether it's coverage of the internet in their neighborhoods, or whether it's technological know-how, or whether they have the equipment to be able to effectively work from home. So there are advantages and challenges, and we usually, African Americans as a whole, often end up on the
That's right. Well, thank you both very much for your expertise. We must close now because we're about to get kicked out of this panel. Once again, I want to thank both of you for joining us today and our audience for their questions and attention. And I will pass this program back to Stephen Small, who will close us out with a few updates. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tracy. Thank you to our colleagues on the panel. Once again, let me take the opportunity to thank my colleagues at the Institute for the Study of Societal Issues and in the Departments of African American and African Diaspora Studies. I'd like to thank our colleagues at the Great Cities Institute at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Thank you also to Mayor Baraka for joining us, to our wonderful moderator, Tracy Jan, who moderated the panel with both equanimity and enthusiasm. And thank you to our panelists, Dr. Elsie Harper-Anderson and Dr. Paul Ong, also Mr. Darren Walker, who have shared with us today their knowledge, evidence, and insights. Finally, thank you to our audience for joining us and for sharing with us your questions. Next week, the third and final panel in this series will feature the Mayor of the City of Houston, Mayor Sylvester Turner, on the topic of diversity and inclusion. Okay, it will be moderated by Natasha Korecki of Politico, national correspondent, and it will include panelists, Dr. Pedro Noguera, the Emory Stoops and Joyce King Stoops Dean of the University of Southern California, Rossier School of Education, Dr. Kathleen Yang Clayton, Clinical Assistant Professor, Departments of Public Administration, and Dr. Elsie, and Dr. There is one more person.
Dr. Gail Christopher.
I beg your pardon, and Dr. Gail Christopher, my apologies. Dr. Gail Christopher will also join us. That's all we have for today. The panel next week will take place at 12 noon Pacific Standard Time, 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. That's all we have for today. Please be safe and well. We look forward to